So welcome to the Writers Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. I'm Zach Powers, the artistic director at the Writers Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome our two guests today, who I will allow to introduce themselves, but Virginia Hartman, who is an old friend of the center, and Annie Liontas, who is a new friend of me. And I don't know if she knows the center very well yet, but hopefully if she doesn't, she will become an old friend in the near future. So both of you, welcome. I hand it off to you, and I'm looking forward to this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us, Zach. Ginny, it's so great to do this together. I know we've been trying to make this happen for a little while. I can't be more excited about the Marsh Queen and your debut and sharing it. It's such a great book, fabulous reading, what my friends and I like to call a page turner. And I'm really excited to talk tonight about craft, about the word, what it means to be a writer and to have that calling. But I know we would love to hear a little bit of the Marsh Queen in your own words. So would you like to read a short passage for us to kick us off?
Sure, thank you. Thanks so much. And let me just say, I'm so grateful to Annie for agreeing to do this with me. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Writers Center, it is such a fantastic place. I know so many published authors who started with a workshop at the Writers Center, or writers who are in a great writing group who started at the Writers Center in a workshop. So if you go to writer.org and check out all of their offerings, it's quite amazing what they do. They're a wonderful organization. They've been around many years now. So check them out. Okay, so here is the cover. I brag about the cover, even though I did not make the cover, but I love the cover of the book. And I'm so grateful to the designers at Gallery Simon & Schuster for giving me a beautiful cover. And it's always really fun to, you live with these characters for a long time and you live with this story, and then you hand it over to someone who conceptualizes it in a different medium, the artists who designed the cover. And I was floored when I saw it. So I'm really happy with it. I'm just going to start with page 1, chapter 1. And so I don't really need to do much explaining. But we can talk about what happens after chapter 1 after I read it. You can get a sense of what you would get if you just open the book. If I were a different person, I could move forward and never look back, never try to fathom the forces that shaped me for the worse. But there are times when a fog rolls in, slow as dusk, beginning with a nodule of regret. I should have, why didn't I, if only? I replay the day my father left us for good, the sun showing orange through the live oak, him pacing at the bottom of the porch steps, 12-year-old me looking down with my baby brother Philip on one hip. I winced as I gently extracted a strand of my dark brown hair from his doughy little grasp. Daddy bounced his feet on the bottom step and squinted up. Look, darling, Miss Jolene next door can help your mama with the baby. So how's about it, Lonnie Mae? You coming with me? My dad hadn't gone fishing in months, but he'd grown restless, knocking into furniture and slamming the screen door. There was a thrumming in the house like the wind before a storm. That day, my mother said, "Boy, go on, you're pacing the house like a caged animal." If I'd have given almost anything to be out fishing in the swamp with him, to draw every creature I saw, to watch and listen as before. But how could I? I had to stay. Now that Philip was here, I served a purpose in my house. I held him while my mother talked on the phone, while she rested or did housework. I knew how to make him laugh those hiccupy laughs. He was my after-school activity, my weekend amusement, my part-time job. My mother no longer shook her head at my hopelessness, nor raised her eyes to heaven. Daddy turned and his boots crunched gravel. He retrieved his fishing pole and tackle from the garage. I put the tip of my braid in my mouth and sucked it to a fine point as he walked out to the end of the dock, his khaki vest sagging with lead weights and lures, the tackle box a drag on his left arm. He turned and looked back for a minute, tilting his head so his face caught the light. I put my hand up to wave, but a shaft of sun was in his eyes and he didn't see. He swiveled back toward the John boat, stepped in, and he was gone. I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, lovely, lovely reading. And, you know, it strikes me that there's so much mystery in this work. I mean, it's sort of like you're always propelled by the hanging question in this novel. But so much of the mystery, in fact, is about, you know, who we are, where we come from, you know, the forces and the people that shape us and what it means, the complications of returning home. Is that something that you're interested in family, in thinking about, you know, returning to origins and roots? You know, Lonnie says, I wish I were a different person and could move forward and never look back.
Yeah, I think that is a central aspect of the book. The mystery does propel people forward, but the family story is what is most compelling to me. And I think the loss that that we all feel, you know, Lonnie has a particular loss, and yet all of us have some loss when we go home, when we go back to a place that we knew before. And Florida changes so rapidly. It's set mostly in Florida. It's a Lonnie. I'll explain a little bit for those who haven't read it. Lonnie is a bird artist at the Smithsonian here in Washington, and she is called home to take care of her mom. And so she takes a leave of absence from work. She goes back to her home that is right at the edge of the marsh in northern Florida. And of course, while she's there, she goes out in her canoe and draws the birds of the marsh, because that's what she does. She draws birds. So while she's there, she finds out a lot of you know, small hints and clues as to what might have happened to her father, because in the scene that I just read, that is the last day that she ever has seen her father. And so his death in the marsh is something that has gone pretty much unresolved for her. And she doesn't like to go home because she has all these unresolved feelings around her father's death. And I'm not giving that away. I mean, that you find that out in chapter 1, that he's gone. But yeah, those family ties that are twisted and that are complicated when there's a loss are pretty front and center in the book. So she has a hard time integrating back into, even for a short time, back into her hometown. And of course, you've got, you know, she lives in a big city now, and she comes back to a very small place. She lives someplace that's pretty paved over, and even the birds that she draws at the Smithsonian are dead. And she comes back and she's in this lush swampland that is full of life and full of creatures that are, some are dangerous, some are beautiful, but there's also the memory of trauma and the memory of death here. So so there's a lot of juxtaposition of opposites within the family relationships, and then also in other ways.
And you know, she does seem to be this kind of person who is always running, right? Like from relationships, from attraction, even, you know, from familial connections and obligations, and is ultimately compelled, right, by her brother Phil to come back at this time. And I was struck by your decision to make her a wandering bird artist, right? Like she's in the city now, but it does seem like she just picks up and goes. So I'm just wondering, you know, how did you discover that about her? What surprised you about her, particularly with the fact that she's reckoning by, you know, pretty early in the book, but certainly at the end of the book, of what it means to return.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. She is a runner. She runs from her emotions. She runs from relationships. The one thing that she feels, one place where she feels comfortable is in her studio, where she looks over the mall and she has her routine and she isn't bothered by other things and other people. So I think the hardest thing for her is to come back, and she's just in it right away. Like, she's fighting with people right away. You know, people are getting on her nerves, and she finds solace in the marsh and in the swamp. But she just feels like, get off my case, everybody. And then she really has to encounter a lot of issues, not just internal issues, but external forces that are forcing her to face up to things and forcing her to dig down deep and have courage about things that she has run from. She's also a physical runner. That's her exercise. So some of the scenes take place, while she's having a run. Some of her contentious conversations with her brother are, they're running together. Or that was an interesting device to use, to have her have conversations while running, because her brother is a stronger runner than she is. So that was fun, because trying to design a scene where someone is a little bit behind, but trying to get the upper hand, and breathing hard while speaking, that kind of thing, was a fun thing to construct.
Yeah, it's kind of a motif for the whole book, right? Always a little bit behind. You can sort of feel that in Lonnie. And I think of, she lies too, right? Like, she obfuscates in the sense of in the sense of like a social contract, which it seems like the book is talking about in almost regional terms, right? Like, this is how we share or do not share knowledge or information in this community. And similarly, gossip has a kind of parallel function, right? That, like, the way you get knowledge out is through gossip. And in fact, one of my favorite scenes in the book is when she's sort of at the hair salon with her sister-in-law, Tammy, who is definitely probably my favorite character besides Lonnie in the book, who I'd love to talk more about. But it's through these other kind of channels. You talk a little bit about like fiblets, right? And those fictions that we tell or that we weave to protect not just ourselves, but others. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to that from a regional position, what it means to be from Northern Florida.
Yes. Well, she, one of the lines when she's in the salon in that scene is, someone's talking badly about her within her hearing. And she says, but when people are talking bad about you in my hometown, you're not supposed to notice, or you're going to pretend like you didn't hear it. And so, yes, there's a custom of the Southern manners where if something bad is happening, you just put on a happy face and you try not to talk about it. Or if somebody's gossiping about you and you hear it, you just kind of act like nothing's happening. And there's a lot that she has to break through, because she kind of is used to, yes, she is lying. She is absolutely lying, and she's called to task about her lying later in the book, because she's kind of, her brother is 12 years younger than she is, and she is just glossing over any upset about her father's death because he was a baby. And he just remembers this guy who tickled him under the cheek and under the chin and then stepped off the earth, right? So he has no memory of what actually happened. And she is continually trying to protect him from any ugly truth that might come out. So she kind of omits, sins of omission. She also doesn't want to be seen as a tourist to the guy who rents her the canoes and others. So she pretends like she's from there, that she lives there all the time, even though, she's got a DC license plate and she's got an acquired Yankee accent, as she puts it. And yeah, she's constantly in tension with what the truth is and what the truth might be. So think people also are telling her things, some of which are questionable and some of which might be true. And she's trying to sort that out too. So she has this interesting relationship with the truth. Like the things that she says that aren't exactly true seem fine to her, but the things that other people tell her that might not be true, she gets kind of annoyed with. But yeah, I think that tension between truth, falsehood, and then niceties is an interesting one that gets explored. And also the fiblet, you know, her sister-in-law, her mother is having some cognitive issues, and her sister-in-law says that they have to tell their mother a lie to have her cooperate, and Lonnie is having none of it. So there, you know, there's that same question of, do we tell the truth? Is it easier to not tell the truth? How do we approach the truth?
Yeah, and we can feel you playing with language to that end, right? And even in thinking about like colloquialisms, right? Like again, this idea of the fiblet, and you even speak to some code switching, right? Like she drops her accent, or she kind of draws on her native accent. So there were a number of expressions and phrases I love, but do you have a favorite colloquialism?
Well, what's wonderful is the memories that she has of her dad, because her dad is country, right? I mean, the mother is from Tallahassee, but she was a debutante. So she, you know, she considered, her family felt that the mother was marrying down, that she was marrying somebody who had kind of a more woodsy background and something that wasn't as refined. So, but what Lonnie loves to remember when she does give herself leave to remember her father are their times in the swamp together, because he knew everything about the birds. He taught her about the birds, and he would make up his own names for the birds. So of course, Lonnie is this, you know, she's got a master's degree. She's an artist, she's a scientist, and she knows all of the Latin names for everything. But she calls back to what her father called the birds. So there's a purple gallinule that is a remarkable bird. And it's one that she's on the hunt for, to draw and from life. And he called it a pond chicken. And she remembers one of her first drawings when she was young was an osprey, and her father called it a fish eagle. And so there is that kind of, she takes comfort in the names of things that she knew and the way that people express themselves when she was growing up, even though she's kind of living in a different world now.
Yeah, I think of Florida almost as a character here, right? Like it really, you use the word lush, and that really does come through. You know, and there's a lot here about sort of the land that is unspoiled, and also, you know, what threatens the ecosystem. So I'm just, what was it like to write Florida, you know, and maybe even if there are maybe misconceptions that you were rooting out, or what you want to create or preserve in the work about Florida?
It's a really complicated place. And I was just there because I had a bunch of book events in Florida. It is so complicated, and the perception of Florida is so complicated. But I think what I take, I mean, I'm a native Floridian, and what I take from Florida and what I want others to know about Florida are the things that are largely hidden in the natural world there. It is such a delicate and somewhat resilient ecosystem. It's hard to be resilient when, you know, 868 people, I think was the latest count, move there every day. So the pressure on the environment is tremendous, but there are places where you can't build because it's wetland. And so some of the wetland has been tamed, and, lakes that wind around developments and things like that, and gators that come up on people's lawns because we're in their territory. But there is such still such vast tracts of wetland that are really rich and beautiful. And thank goodness for the people who, designated the Everglades as a national park. But I think even more of that has to be protected, because it will be gone. And the pressure on the environment is tremendous with the population growth.
Yeah, we can feel, some of your, like, the real connection, sort of connection of home and wanting to keep it, preserve it, and that was also one of my favorite moments, or sort of favorite threads in the work. But I do want to talk about Tammy. I know we have about 5 minutes before we kind of opening. I want to talk about Tammy. What was it like to write her, and maybe tell us a little bit about her? She's like a live wire. Yeah,
Tammy is Lonnie's sister-in-law. And she and Phil got married right out of high school. Tammy was pregnant, and Lonnie had something to say about that, because she was 12 years older and she had helped put Phil through college. And yet when she came home and met her tiny niece, her heart kind of melted, and she kind of swallowed everything that she was going to say to them. But Tammy is, as characters go, is kind of a novelist's dream, because she is in direct conflict with the main character. She seems, when we meet her, to be territorial and grabby, and they're talking about, renting out the mother's house and dividing up the mother's things, which are always kind of contentious issues within a family. And so she gets in Lonnie's way right away. She also reveals Lonnie's own kind of snobbery and prejudice. And so she reveals something about the main character, because this book is first person present tense, and we're in Lonnie's head all the time. So one thing about, writing a character like that is, how do we see that character from the outside? And she has to be reflected through the actions of other characters, and bouncing off of other people. And in some of her first scenes with Tammy, we see Tammy from her point of view, so we don't like Tammy that much at first. But we also see her through kind of Tammy's lens. And so that's really fun. Those are fun scenes to write, and I hope they're fun to read. And yeah, Tammy is an interesting character, because she changes and develops through the story as well. I don't want to give too much away, but you always think of the main character changing. And some of the ways that Tammy changes are through the reader's perception of her, because we only have that kind of limited view that Lonnie has. So that's kind of a fun aspect of reading on. Did you have any other particular questions about Tammy?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking that Tammy really kind of keeps her honest in a way that no one else in the book does, and kind of forces her to confront, you called it snobbery, but even just her remoteness and kind of decision to go it alone, and Tammy kind of insists against that, and I think their relationship is a great point of tension in the work. You said they're in direct confrontation, but it also feels like, there are a lot of elements at work here to build tension throughout, right? There's the mystery, the kind of longing for dad, and that familial connection, the complications around, mom's entry into assisted living, right? And then all of these hanging questions, and Tammy seems to really tap into that. And I'm thinking about, I read an interview with Benjamin Percy once where he talked about transitioning from short stories in the short form to the long form in the novel. And he talks about initially writing out all of Flannery O'Connor's stories just to understand, like, okay, beat by beat, what's happening here. And he realized he had to do sort of the same thing with the novel, because he would start a novel and he would almost shut it down right away, right? Because that's what you do with short fiction. And he realized actually chapters don't function like that. He calls them flaming chainsaws, where, you throw one up in the air and that's going, and then you throw another one up in the air, and right. So then you're juggling them. And rather than shutting down or kind of containing a universe the way the short fiction must, the novel just opens and opens with more questions. And I really feel that tension coming through. And I'm just thinking, how do you think about tension in a book like this?
Well, I mean, I am all about keeping that thread going and having a reader reach the end of a chapter and have it both have a punctuation point that says that's the end of the chapter, and also a tease that makes the person turn the page to the next chapter. That's how I like to read. And I always talk about West with the Night, Beryl Markham's book, because boy, does that happen in that book. You get to the end and it's like snap. And then you go, oh, but I've got to see the next chapter. I've got to see what happens next. So that is my goal. I hope I've achieved it in this book. But I would like to talk a little bit about your book. Can we do that?
Sure.
This is Annie's book, Let Me Explain You, from Scribner. And why don't you just tell us the basic facts that we need to know about the book? And then I have some questions for you about it.
Okay, sure. So Let Me Explain You is a comic novel, a family novel. It's an immigrant narrative, which draws on my own experiences as an immigrant. And essentially it opens up with an email from a Greek patriarch to his daughters and his ex-wife, basically telling them that he believes he's going to die in 10 days. And here's all the things that's wrong in their lives and that they should go and fix real quick while they still have the time. So you can imagine that goes really well. Everybody responds really well to that. But before the 10 days is up, he disappears. And so the daughters and the ex-wife have to sort of determine what's become of him. And in the meantime, are sort of reckoning with their own journey home, emotionally and otherwise.
So we have another missing father.
Yeah, just parents missing everywhere. Yeah.
It's interesting that you call it a comic novel, because I think like the humor stands out right away, but you also are able to get so much of a combination between humor and pain in these family dynamics. And I wonder if when you were writing it, you were going for that, or if that just happened naturally.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking about that Tolstoy quote that you have to write the light and the darkness, and I don't know that I was consciously plotting that. I think the humor in my work is it naturally tells me the work is alive. I mean, a lot of cultures use humor as a coping mechanism. It's like probably better than drinking or drugs, right? So right. And so it's just kind of a natural mode for me. But it also tells me like this thing is breathing and kicking. But of course, writing, I think when we're thinking about the project of fiction, it's the human project, and it's about longing and unfinished business and kind of existential questions that push us and often ask us to return home. So
Right.
I don't know. I do think that once I figured out I'm a very voice-driven writer. So once I figured out the kind of voices that I was playing with, it seemed essential that humor was there. But just like, just like so much of life, there's pain and longing and sort of bitterness sometimes beneath. And like the word nostalgia is a Greek word, nostos, meaning sweet, but algos, and return to home, but also bitter. And so this is, nostalgia is actually bittersweet, and because it contains all of that.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about the multiple voices. You work with multiple voices in this novel, and each one is we feel so immersed in that person. I mean, you use the third person, very close point of view for each one, but we just kind of the whole world of each of them is contained in that voice. And what did it feel like writing that?
Well, I would say it's kind of maddening to write multiple points of view and multiple perspectives in a single novel. I've learned that, I mean, part of it is, you want to fit the whole world in some ways into your work. And so for me, it was like everybody should have a voice, especially in a novel that is dominated by a single patriarchal voice. It was like, no, he can't be the only person to speak. We have to have the call and the response. But on a craft level, it is kind of maddening to work through. And you realize that every thread, every voice really needs to be essential to the larger arc of the narrative. And if that's not true, then maybe they don't belong in this book, or they shouldn't have their own point of view. So there was a lot of finessing of like who gets to talk, who gets their voice heard, which I think is ultimately a political question, like who speaks and how do we listen. But I think that for this book, it ended up being pretty essential. Yeah.
Well, and you weave them so seamlessly. It's almost as if one voice is answering the other. But I imagine in constructing the book, that were they always in the order that they appear in the book now, or did you switch them around sometimes?
That's kind of the amazing thing about revision, right? Like I think with a novel, you write to the end, and then it tells you, oh, this is the book I'm actually writing. And then you go back, and at the end, you've sort of written 4 or 5 books sometimes. What was revision like for you with this book?
Oh my gosh, it was horrendous. And Zach knows, because I just wrote this article for the Writer's Center magazine about outlining versus throwing it all together and then deciding what goes first, what goes second, what goes third. So I'm outlining all future books. I just decided because I have rewritten this novel many times and rearranged it and decided different things about it and so on. And it's kind of amazing that it came all together finally. I mean, I don't know if you feel that way, but it definitely did not start like from the beginning and then I wrote through to the end. Absolutely not. I've rearranged it so many times, and I'm happy with the way it is. And I think that you're right, in revision, you make those connections. You figure out what it's supposed to be, what the organic shape really needs to be. And I'm really happy and satisfied with the shape that it is. And of course, you work with an editor who says, you know what, you have to toss out this section because it's a tangent, and I had a few of those, and I fought for them because I liked those tangents. But in the end, they didn't belong. So
killing our darlings. And I can imagine that was such a feat for you, because it's such a catalytic structure where, this event yields the next. So that is tremendous lift. And I've always found that models seem to be kind of useful. I mean, I realized too late that in some ways, Let Me Explain You was King Lear. And thankfully, because like, who feels like they can use that as a model? It's a bit baffling. But I'm working on a new novel now, and I'm very excited about it. It's really fun. It's like a heist narrative. with some mischief and trickery. And a friend was asking me if I had a model in mind. And then I realized it was the Odyssey. Like I'm actually, this is like an Odyssean kind of structure. Do you ever use models? Have you thought about that? Or did you do that with this book?
What's that Alice Walker book, The Secret of Our Gardens? I'm getting the title wrong. I read that book a long time ago, and I loved the different voices in it. And so I would say the novel, I'm also working on a second novel, and that has been an inspiration. I wouldn't say a model, but an inspiration in exploring different voices in different chapters. And of course, Let Me Explain You is a model for me, because you use different voices in different chapters so effectively. But I don't have any classical models that I would say I consciously draw from.
I remember a writer really stuck. He was really stuck on his novel, which was kind of like a space opera, but then he realized he was writing Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And these, like sometimes the model is, the Odyssey is just like, it happens to, but sometimes the models kind of come from anywhere,
Well, there's a great Paris Review interview with Kurt Vonnegut. It's in the yellow volume of Paris Review interviews, and I often read it to my students. And it says, there are all these tropes, all these fairy tales, and all of these stories, and how do you get away from them? It was the question, and he said, listen, if we're going to ask for people's time and they want to be entertained by what we write, there's going to be one of those stories in there, one way or another. I'm paraphrasing him, and he says it much better. But I like that idea that, okay, maybe there's nothing new under the sun. There's my take on what I think is new. But sometimes story shapes can guide you. I mean, especially if you can make them original, if you can make them seem like they've never existed on this earth before. But they satisfy a reader in the way that those traditional stories have. I think that's a kind of a good goal.
Yeah.
Can I ask you another question? Stavrula, is that how you pronounce the main character's name in Let Me Explain You?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and she's known as Stevie as her nickname. She actually acknowledges in one of her early sections that she is intense. And I think it's so interesting that she has that self-knowledge. She knows she's intense, and yet she goes forward in the same intensity. And I just wonder what it was like to draw a character like that, who has the self-knowledge and is like, okay, man, that's how I am. I'm going to be that way. So just get over it. What was that like, writing her?
Oh, total fun. I mean, we talk all the time as writers about how every character is a little bit of us. And that's true for all of my characters. I don't think I could kind of plunge into their voices without that kind of anchor, but it's a little bit like a train that's just like full steam ahead. Doesn't matter that there's a brick wall, right? There's something really self-determinant about that character, sometimes to her own detriment or alienation or isolation. But she's also a little bit she's the kind of character who knowledge is not her issue. It's really either waiting for the world to catch up or for the message to be received, a bit of like a Cassandra, so she'll be the person speaking the truth at the end of the world, and no one will realize it or want to hear about it. Which I think is a little bit like writers, like writers see some things that it's kind of our job culturally to reflect the world back to itself, but like, we'd rather like watch Abbott Elementary. It's like much easier. But when we are ready to engage, like those are those are the and it's why we read, right? Well, that's why we return to the page ultimately. But she was really fun and also a little bit maddening. And, I'm thinking about Lonnie, right? Like all of our characters have a bit of a fatal flaw, right? And that's how we understand them or sympathize with them. And we feel like, they're, characters, they're just like us, Yeah.
Yeah.
When did you decide or sort of claim being a writer?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I went to American University to get my MFA. And I think there was a time, I think that was kind of the moment, because when I was 12, I said, I'm going to be a writer. And then I got distracted and I worked in, I did a lot of different things and I worked in a different industry. And then I always took writing classes during college, after college, on the side while I was working. And I think it was when I made the decision to go back to graduate school full time and become immersed. And AU was such a good immersion experience because they had visiting writers and they had workshops with people who came to read, and a wonderful faculty. It was a very nurturing place, and all my peers, I felt like I had to write up to them, even though they were younger than I was, because I waited 9 years before I went back to grad school. And I felt at that point like, okay, now when I graduate, how do I carry this this wonderful sense of immersion into my life? Because life has a way of kind of taking you over, and I hung around with a lot of people and still do with my friends from the MFA program. And I remember having a conversation with my friend Sarah Sorkin, and when people asked, what do you do? You could say, oh, well, I teach, and I do some writing. You have a choice of how you embrace that. And I think she said, you say you're a writer, and then whatever else you do is extra. And I think that was really important, to claim that identity and to say, and when people say, what do? You say, I'm a writer. So I say that to people who are struggling to find time in the day to write and do their job and have children and do all the other things that life requires, and have a partner, and tend to the things that are important in your life, of course, but to claim that identity and say, I'm a writer. I think that's really important. And to listen to that 12-year-old kid who knew, even though, it was easy to let the world distract you. But that's a good question. I like that.
Beautiful answer. That's a really good, it is like a second job, right? Just it really requires a great deal from us. And so, yeah, why shouldn't we claim it? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. If anybody has any questions, just go ahead and put them in the chat. And it looks like we have some in there.
Yeah, it looks like they haven't dropped yet.
Okay.
Yeah, but maybe we could talk a little bit, you spoke about your cohort at AU, but I'm just wondering how you build or engage in community, right? In community of writers and readers, and what does that look like for you?
Well, I have wonderful colleagues at George Washington University, where I teach now, and I'm inspired every day by my colleagues there. And we have the same kinds of wonderful conversations about who are you reading and who do you admire, and what's the best thing that you've been doing lately, that what readings have you gone to, because there are wonderful readings all throughout the area, and the Writer Center has a lot of them right in their space in Bethesda. For community, I think the Writers Center, again, is a wonderful place to find people. And I teach a workshop there at least once a year. And almost to a workshop, the group has come together after the class as a writing group. And I check in with people frequently from that connection. I still stay in good touch with the people that I was in graduate school with, and those are some of my closest friends and writing partners. Sarah Sorkin is a friend who lives in my neighborhood, or I moved into her neighborhood actually, and she was in the program with me, and we get together at least once a week and hold each other accountable. What's going on in your creative life? What are you working on now? What are your goals for next week? And that is invaluable. I just think it's good to find people that have like minds and are curious about writing and, you know, want to kind of hold your feet to the fire about getting your own writing done. Well, how about you, Annie? Sorry to call you Lonnie.
I love that. That's how connected we are to those people. Yeah, I mean, I do have I have the MFA cohort that I was pretty close with, at least a few people, and a really strong community in Philly and DC. Of course, you know, like you and I love our hallway chats talking about who we're reading, what agony we're inside of right now and in today's writing life. Yeah, and I talk to my students all the time about the importance of finding your people, you know, whether they're your trusted readers or you know, people who are moved by writing and art the way that you are, because the industry can be cold, right? But what really matters is how we feel when we're inside of it and how we share the work. I think there's a question here. Did I find it easier to write the plot linearly, or did I write alternating perspectives? Yeah, I don't think. I mean, it was my first novel, and I feel like almost no one writes anything in a straight line in a first novel, because we haven't quite figured out. You don't quite have the tools. You know, you're like the kitten trying to figure out the claws. So I'm pretty sure that I was jumping around quite a bit. But once I realized that central thread of the missing family member, you know, this like hanging question, then all the threads started to wrap around that. And it became, you know, the kind of raison d'etre and the dominant narrative that determined, you know, who speaks when and what does that look like. But there was a lot where it was just like me writing a single, you know, I wrote, for instance, there's a sibling relationship really at the heart of this. I'm really interested in sisters and sisterhood, I think in all of my work. And in this particular, I'd written maybe like a full chapter about what it was like for those sisters to immigrate and you know, learn English, and ended up being one sentence in the book. You know, you just like cut it out, and it was a really good sentence, but it was one sentence, totally distilled. Okay, we have a couple more.
Can I just say one thing about your book also, is that you have a really interesting structure, and you use different structural devices because you have a ticking clock, right? So it starts day 9, and then, you know, there's kind of a countdown to what the father thinks is going to be his death day, and you also have the 5 stages of the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross construct of the 5 stages of you know, coping with death and dying, and that kind of gives a scaffolding on which you hang all of the events that are happening. And I think that that's really interesting. And I just want to ask if you came up with that when you had arranged things pretty much in the order you wanted them to be in.
Yeah, I think it might have been sort of simultaneous, right? Like Antonia Nelson talks about the clock, and she's talking about it in short fiction, but there's always a clock, and it tends to be invisible, but sometimes can be a bit, pronounced. For your book, it's Lonnie has to get back to DC because she could lose her job, right? And that pressure is closing in. And I think, clocks are a form of pressure. I mean, in our regular lives, right? It's like, oh shit, I'm going to be late. I have to get to work. And that kind of mechanism is really good for building tension across a novel, where tension is essential in a way that we don't always realize, I think, when we start writing novels. So I think those structures grew, I would say, like pretty deep into the process, particularly the Kubler-Ross that you're alluding to. Once I understood the kind of work I was building, and you start to look around, and the writer Dana Spiotta says, like, a novel, while you're writing it becomes a sponge. It just like takes all this stuff in, and so I had to have like a critical mass of the work to know what I was writing, and then start looking around and saying, like, okay, what can feed that? How can I deepen this understanding? And so Kubler-Ross was part of that. We have.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you the next question.
Okay, go ahead.
It's from Kathy. But first, I just want to do a little shout out, and I know you'll be mad at me, but someone on this call is also really an important part of my inspiration in writing community, and that is Myra Sklaroo, who was head of the program at AU. And I just want to say you're great, and you're an inspiration every day. Kathy Haley asks Annie, I haven't read your book, but I'd like to know more about how you integrate your Greek heritage in the book. I look forward to reading it, especially because I am also Greek American. So how did you integrate that Greek heritage, Annie?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, Greek people love food. So food is everywhere in this book. It is, it's its own language in a way. And, there's a sort of scene where I steal a bit from Proust, the Proust Madeleine, where for my character, he's biting into some galaktoboriko, which is a Greek pastry. There's a couple of, Stevie is a chef, but, her mentor is also a chef, and growing up, there's almost a kind of mythological Gabriel Garcia Marquez inspired scene where they butcher a hog together, but they're always aware of, like, this is a life we're taking, this is, so food ends up being a pretty important, like, motif, and a way for characters to connect when they can't connect in any other way, either because they've lost language or because it's family and it's hard to sustain those relationships when you're like, Deborah Eisenberg says, you meet people in your family you'd otherwise never meet. And that's very true for this kind of motley crew of people. But also just there's family lore and mythology. There are Greek idioms, like when I was growing up, my father who was spoke English with a pretty thick accent. And he was a welder, and I'm the first college educated person in my family, and one day he got like so befuddled and he said, what do you want me to do, smell my fingers? And we were like, what? and that is actually a Greek idiom that goes back to ancient Greece, when they would be betting on Olympic Games and they would dip their fingers in oil and smell them and make a prediction, and it means basically, do you think I'm a mind reader? But we were like, what are you talking about? We do not want to smell anything. And so those kinds of great, that's such great fodder for a character and for the work. And it is also, part of my origin and part of my heritage. Yeah.
Can I read just one short description from this book?
Sure.
It's when they're talking about the youngest child, Ruby. And it's just so indicative of your writing, where no word is wasted and we know everything we need to know in such a short, compressed space. Ruby was prematurely lovely, introverted despite or because of years of attention, and dissatisfied with where she was in life. The only people who knew the latter were those closest to Ruby. To everyone else, Life for Ruby must be a perfect cocktail umbrella. I just love that description.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you so much. That was lovely. And it was so great to talk to you. I hope you all pick up the Marsh Queen. I had like 10 more questions we never got to, but it's just such a fun night for me. I hope you all support Jenny's work and the Writers Center. And thank you all for the experience.
And Annie's work too. A novel coming up, a nonfiction book coming up, and Let Me Explain You is on your bookstore shelves as well.